Hey everybody, Andy Kennedy with Andy Kennedy Co. here again with Mary, our magician. Yay. If you watched our last episode of our or listened to our podcast or our YouTube channel, I interviewed Miss Mary about a few things. We were talking mostly about Mercury retrograde, but also about her life and her journey working with Andy Kennedy Co. and the stuff that we do and the classes and what she has learned over the last almost 2 years. I was thinking about this in the shower as well, Mary, this morning of like, oh my gosh, at some point we're going to be able to say we've worked together for 2 years, and that's really, really magical and special. And I'm just so
Yep.
grateful for you. And today we're going to flip the roles, and Mary is going to be interviewing me, which we kind of thought about after our last session. So for my listeners to learn a little bit more about me, and then also to launch Mary into her very own podcast. So yay for that. This will be the first episode of that as well. So whether you're on Andy Kennedy Co. Or Mary's, tell me what the name of it is again. I know it's such an awesome name.
Not so good at small talk.
That's right. I was like, I know it's the small talk. Not so on Mary's Not So Good at Small Talk podcast. Follow us, subscribe, whatever, even cross market. Let's, trade up and go follow us on the other one if you're not there. So without further ado, Mary, let's just go ahead and get rolling so we can get it all in, because I know that I'm going to derail us, I'm sure, at some point during your
Oh, this is going to be a story, all right. I am so excited, and this is a very interesting one, and I can't wait for everyone else to know about the journey that is you. So I do have a couple of pointers here, but let's just start with your childhood. What was it like growing up? And because, like, to me right now, you're such a free and eccentric person, but what was childhood like for Andy?
Okay, free and eccentric. Well, thank you for that. I'll just preface this with saying that I'm 49 years old this year, and I don't feel 49. I definitely still feel like I'm in my 30s. Physically, I actually feel better at 49 than I did in my earlier years, just because of taking care of my health and adding whole food concentrates and functional food and all of that. And so if that's something that interests you, reach out, because that's a whole other conversation. But growing up, I grew up in Washington, D.C. And my mother would say that I wasn't sickly. I wasn't a sick kid. But I definitely remember being sick a lot. I remember, colds and flus and strep throats and ear infections and all of those things that, kids shouldn't struggle with. And I know now with the work that we do in health that kids don't struggle with when they've got something to bridge the gap in their nutrient deficiency. But I grew up in a suburbia, Northern Virginia, on a lake, only child. My parents, the older I got, the more my parents' income kind of caught up with their lifestyle. My mother worked in advertising, and my father worked as an economist for the government, for the military, actually, at a think tank for the Defense Department as an economist. And they grew up in Chicago, so they moved away from family. We didn't have a lot of family. And I was always sort of struggling as an only child to find my best friend, because I feel like I cycled through a lot of best friends. I didn't have anyone in the house to like fight with or play with, or, as an only child. So I entertained myself quite a bit. I was a free spirit back then, probably a little obstinate, I'm sure my parents would say, stubborn, and very independent, but introverted. And even though, I could kind of be an ambivert, I could definitely, get outside the box and play and get comfortable in a crowd. I wasn't shy, really. I was around more adults. My parents' friends didn't have kids. My my nieces or my aunts and uncles didn't have kids. So I think for the first maybe 6 or 7 years of my life, there weren't a lot of children. So I was around a lot of adults, some of which liked to throw parties. And so
Fun.
I was around a lot of adult parties. There's some really interesting stories around, like, for one, me maybe 3 or 4 years old, going around and taking a sip out of everybody's margarita and then tumbling down the stairs drunk.
Wow.
So yeah. So, but the one thing that I wanted to bring up in this section was to tell you about my imaginary friends. So I spoke to my imaginary friends a lot, and there's a cool connection. I had names for them. I would talk to them. I remember a vivid memory of sitting on the stairs in timeout, looking down into the basement that I was very afraid of, and calling in my imaginary friends to sit there with me and just chatter and keep me safe. And, I'm sure I was crying because I was in trouble. But I vividly remember, like, hugs from these imaginary friends, right? And we know that they were my spirit team and my spirit guides and my guardians and my angels and, all of that. But one of them in particular, and for those of you that are new to spirit guides, is going to sound really far-fetched, but one of them in particular I called Sawawiwa. I'm 3 years old and my parents are thinking this is just, nonsense. I had flip-flop, and I had jogger, and I had, like, all of these weird names. But Sawawiwa is the most,
At
like,
3, you named your imaginary friend that?
Sawawiwa. No, that's what she told me her name was, right?
Oh, wow. Okay.
Okay. So it's funny, you don't know this story. Okay, so fast forward, we lose our connection to our imaginary friends, right? Like, people either make fun of you, or your parents tell you to stop talking to them, or whatever. And we shut down that seventh chakra to live in society, right? And be normal in society. Unless you have, extremely open woo-woo parents who tell you, like, good job, like, let's talk to your imaginary friends today, and they wouldn't call, let's talk to your spirit team today, right? So fast forward to the work that I started doing in Oregon, and I'll come back to that when you get to those questions. But I started, I worked with this very first channeler that I worked with, intuitive. She was amazing. Her name was Sarah Felez, when I lived in Eugene, Oregon, and started connecting me to my spirit team, reconnecting me to my spirit team. And my gatekeeper is Merlin. And so I most of the time talked to him when I was getting started. And then who pops in but Sacagawea? And I had this very vivid, like, tear felt, like, super juicy, tingling feeling, like, oh my gosh, this is the woman. And so you may not know the story of Sacagawea, but she's a Native American woman guide that guided Lewis and Clark across the country to, like, map the northern states of the United States, right? So she's very famous. And she came to me and said, like, I've been with you your whole life. And I'm like, oh my God, I just couldn't pronounce your name when I was 3 years old. Like, of course, like, that
That's
for me was one
amazing.
of the things that's like, I'm not making this up, right? Like, that's crazy. Because it's not like anyone was talking to me at 3 or 4 years old about Sacagawea and her story as a Native American.
Mm.
Maybe you hear about Pocahontas, I mean, maybe, but yeah, anyway. So very creative childhood as well. I went to art school in college, so I'm always drawing. I was always coloring and making art, and yeah, it's very, very creative child. Trying to think of anything else. Yeah. So anything
So
come up?
you've always been a free spirit, and I feel like being an only child urged you to become more of your creative self, which I think you've always been. It
Yeah.
just came out at an earlier age.
Yeah, and the intuitive piece came out at an early age too. The phone would ring and I would know who was calling, and I was tested for ESP at one point, but I choked during tests, and so it was like, they're flashing me flashcards, and doctor or the psychiatrist, psychologist, whatever, sent me away, like, no, Andy doesn't have any intuitive gifts or whatever. And so I sort of dropped that and that until later, until I was like,
Mhm.
oh yeah, wait a minute. Yeah, I do. No one taught me how to use them. Right. If I had had better teachers as a young child, to help me use those gifts, I probably would have been further along at an earlier age, but it's okay now in hindsight. It all happens as it's supposed to happen.
Exactly. And like if you trace it back to like where you are now and how you were when you were a child, there are these traits that keep recurring all throughout your life. Like you've always had this awakened intuition. You've always been more receptive to universal messages. You've always been very creative and eccentric and free with your lifestyle. So I know that you had a stint in Scotland. You've been to Europe. You've been to a lot of European countries.
I have.
What made you decide to go to Europe at such a young age?
So, well, my first trip to Europe was actually with my grandmother. She took me to Italy when I was 14, and that opened my eyes. I remember thinking I want to live in Italy at some point. And in college, I did a semester. And before 2 years of Spanish. So I had a lot of languages. I was very good at languages, a lot of languages. And so it was my last year, my fifth year of French, 2 years, 3 years of high school and 2 years of college French. So I was pretty fluent in French, and did a semester short term. We had January term. So it was just 1 month in Paris. And January in Paris kind of sucks, but we ignored the weather and had a blast. And I was doing an independent study in watercolor at the time. So that also opened my eyes. We spent a weekend in Amsterdam, got into a little trouble there. And so I never was there longer than a month. And so I moved after college. And I did college in Florida. After college, I moved to Oregon to study sustainability. I decided I didn't want to be an artist. And in my last semester of college, I found the topic of sustainability and did an internship living on an intentional community in Oregon. And that's what led me to astrology and herbalism and aromatherapy. And the astrologer actually is the woman that I met her at a Saturday market, and she did my chart, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And so then she teaches a class on intuition and connecting to your spirit team. And so that's Sarah. So I started taking classes with her, and I had two friends that were following another friend over to Scotland. And the girl, the female of this couple, Goldie, was pretty much my best friend at the time. And they were moving to Scotland. They were doing it the correct way. They were getting work visas. They were,
Mhm.
saving their money. They
They were
were,
preparing.
they were preparing. And so they left in September of 1996. And they were going to be there for 6 months, maybe longer. They didn't know. Their friend was going to study for a semester abroad in Scotland. And it was Jason, Goldie's boyfriend, Jason. It was his roommate. So I don't even remember his name. So he was studying. So Jason, was following him, and Goldie was going with Jason, right? So it was like this wave of them going to Glasgow in Scotland. And so she kind of prepped all summer, and I was like, I think I'm going to come with you. And she was like, oh my God, that would be amazing. Come. But I was like, I think I'm just going to travel. I'm just going to go over there and travel. I'm going to save my money, maybe do some Fish shows, because Fish was a band that we followed at the time. And they were doing a European tour. So that was my goal. But I'm the kind of person that saves a bunch of money and spends it all in one place. So I saved a bunch of money. I was bartending, saved a ton of money, and then went on Fish tour a little early and did a whole West Coast Fish tour. And by the time that my departure was planned for December. So they were going to, get over there, establish themselves, and I was going to come over in December. I also saved a bunch of money, but hit the road in November and spent the majority of my money on this West Coast Fish tour. By the time that I got to DC, and, I had a one-way ticket to Scotland. I didn't know how long I was going to be in Europe. This was going to be my big European adventure
So spontaneous.
that I had always wanted to do. Left my cats in DC with my parents and got on a one-way ticket, got on a plane, but it was planes, trains, and automobiles. I mean, like it was a standby ticket. I didn't do it right. I didn't know how to fly standby like I do now. So it was a fiasco. And by the time I got to Glasgow, I had spent all but like $150. So I landed in Scotland with, I mean, I'd saved up like 3 grand. So, you know, I had spent it all in Vegas. We went to Vegas too, by the way. So we did like a
Wow.
whole West Coast tour that included Vegas, very expensive hotels, right? Spent all my money. So, yeah, so I had $150, and Goldie and Jason were like, it's no big deal. Like, you know, you can stay with us. You can, I mean, they were laughing at me, but I was kind of like, que sera, right? Like, whatever.
Yeah,
It didn't scare me. It didn't, you know, I was kind of like, I'll figure it out. So, I ate a lot of rice and ramen noodles, you know, really cheap food.
mhm.
The bar fed me a little bit, and I started painting the boards outside the bar. And that's what put my foot in the door of the pub that they worked at. Is there's blackboards outside of pubs in Scotland, and you know, someone designs them. And I said, these suck. Like, do you want me to make better ones? And they both worked at 2 different pubs. So I said, you know, I'll design the boards at both pubs. They paid me 5 quid a board. Some of them, the bigger bar had maybe 10 boards. So, you know, you're talking
You
$50
were
every
just
time I did it.
visiting the pub? You were just visiting the pub and you saw the boards and you're like, "These are ugly. Let me fix them for
Oh
you."
yeah, I was
Like,
like,
you
who
weren't
the
actually
hell?
like,
I was like, who the hell is doing your boards? Like, that is absolutely terrible. That's totally
"So
piss poor
random."
work. Yeah, so random. But I was like, I can do that. I saw that and I was like, this can be my niche, you know? So I started doing that for both of the pubs. And the owner owned both of the pubs. And so the owner was like, oh my gosh, this is great. And then eventually those guys were like, we're leaving. We don't like it here. It's cold, it's rainy, it's dark. You can have our flat. The flat was like 10 quid a week, super cheap, like not a good neighborhood, but I didn't care. And you just left the money in the drawer, and the landlord came into the condo or the apartment and got it, like random. Like, now that I think about it, I'm like, oh
Wow.
my God, if I had a daughter, like if my parents knew that, yeah. Um, but yeah, I don't really have a lot of fear. So
So you came in there fearless and spontaneous and random most times, but you were living and traveling alone. I mean, you had friends, you knew this person, but technically you were alone with very little experience on a tight budget. Didn't that mess up like how your thought process, your psyche eventually? Did you have like moments where you were super down? You weren't like always optimistic, right?
course, of course. The brain deletes things. Like, the brain is meant to just dump the really harsh stuff, right? That's why we don't remember a lot of our trauma. So we're talking 20 plus years ago, 30 almost years ago now, 25 maybe. So the one vivid, I mean, I have several memories, but the one vivid memory I have is I had a very thin sleeping bag, a very thin pad. You know, I had all of my belongings were in a backpack. And and a very thin blanket and very thin clothes, right? Like, I had Oregon clothes in Scotland. Okay. And Oregon is temperate rainforest. It's rainy, it gets cold, but it's not like Colorado, right? Like, if I'd had Colorado clothes, that would have been better, right? Mountain. Yeah. So it's maybe the second week that I'm there. Well, actually, even the like second day that I was there, I was sitting in the pub, and they call them punters, right? A local or a regular, right? This punter comes up to me and he starts yabbering at me like, yeah, where are you from? And blah, blah, blah. And right. And I'm like, by the second sentence, I'm like, this guy's not speaking English, right? So I'm like, what? I ask, and he's like, you know, what? And he's drunk, and you know, he's just a regular at a pub, right? Like, who is this guy? So then he's just yammering at me, and it's all I can do to keep from crying. And so one of my first experiences is like, oh my God, what have I done? Right? Like, I was brave, but I was also like, I'm
Like
gonna
it's sunk in.
oh yeah, I'm like, I'm gonna have to figure this out. And I full on had culture shock. I had culture shock when I came home too. Culture shock is legit, like where your brain gets scrambled. You have no idea what you're doing. You don't know how you're gonna figure it out. And if you don't have the tools, which at that point I didn't have a lot of the tools I have now, you're like I'm totally fucked. Like, there's no way I'm getting out of this situation, right? Like,
Yeah.
this is scary. And Goldie could kind of see the look on my face. It was at the bar she was bartending at. She comes over. Her bar was much smaller,
Mhm.
much more like local crowd. The bigger bar, rowdy AF, like totally. I mean, McSorley's it was a music venue, so it was big bar,
Oh.
big craziness, knife fights sometimes, just crazy. Like, think of like Coyote Ugly crazy. So, um,
Oh, okay.
yeah. So
Yeah.
the
I've seen the
first
movie.
bar, locals bar, totally like pretty chill. After work kind of crowd, right? Not crazy Glaswegian crowd. Um, so she comes over and she's like, kind of shoos the guy away and is like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "I don't know what he's saying." Like, so that's one memory. The other one is me freezing my A off in the apartment, the flat that we had, because the only heater was in their bedroom. And I was next to a brick wall and it was pouring rain and I could hear through the window, like, and feel the wetness seeping in this brick wall, like big rocks, like not our like US bricks, like brick houses, like, no, this was like
Mhm.
giant rocks,
Oh, like in The
giant
Hobbit.
square rocks. Yeah, in this like apartment building. And we were on the third floor, so we were way high up. And I just remember thinking, and I'm sitting there, I'm so cold that I have a teacup in the covered in the blanket with me, in the sleeping bag with me, steaming the blanket with, that's my heater, is this hot teacup, and I'm drinking the tea and I'm like, what have I, again, like, this is 2 or 3 weeks into it, like, how am I going to get out of this? And I was always the kind of person that was like, I'm not calling home. I'm so independent and so obstinate that I was like, I am not calling home for help. I have to figure this out. Because my parents would have been like, get on a plane, you're coming home.
But you would not admit defeat.
No,
Like, no way.
no, no,
How were
I
you
didn't. I
able
mean, I
to
had
get out
moments
of
like
that?
that when I moved to Colorado as well, where I was on food stamps and I had no business being on food stamps, but I didn't make enough money and
Mm.
I went for help, government help, and went to the the food bank for food, like, yeah, I I would rather take handouts from a stranger than I would from my parents, I think.
So you're super independent, and I mean, on top of that, you're also so introverted, but you have friends. And what was it like making new friends in a foreign country and then, leaving the old ones behind?
Um,
Like, did that really affect you eventually?
an interesting question, because I feel like starting out, like I had mentioned, with like cycling through a lot of best friends in my life, moving schools, moving all the way down to Florida for college from DC and driving there. And then, I did 2 winter terms, one in New Mexico, I didn't know any of those students. They were all older than me. So I had to make friends there. Oh, I went to camp every summer too. So I think, growing up, like where my parents would thrust me into situations where I had to make friends quickly. I didn't feel ever like alone or scared about being alone or scared even about like walking through a shady place alone, like getting mugged in Scotland or something. Same, going to all the way to Oregon. I went to Oregon with one friend, but we wound up in kind of different circles pretty quickly. So, no, I don't have trouble making friends. And even like latching on to a friend right away. Like I tend to find best friends right away. So my friend in Scotland was Debbie. And she just took me in. I mean, Goldie and Jason were only there with me for about 6 weeks. And then they left. And Debbie and I became close and we would go get tea and go to concerts together. And yeah, she was, and I tend to also fall in love very quickly. So I fell in love over there
Mm.
and wound up living with my boyfriend, Charlie, in Scotland.
That's definitely been an adventure of places and relationships.
Yeah.
And I know you mentioned you've worked like odd jobs, but mostly from the stories that you've told me, you worked at the pub, and that's kind of like where you bonded the most with the people that you stayed with in Europe. And I also remember that you were telling me, you brought this up about the Celestine Prophecy and how you introduced this to your friends there. And it just blew my mind because it was such a dark and random time for you. You must have felt so weird and uncomfortable, and plus the culture shock. But for you to shed light yourself to these people that I'm sure you needed it more than they did, but like where did you find the strength to do that, like the inspiration to even do it, you know?
I think it just came naturally. It was just synchronous because um so I was reading the Celestine Prophecy in Oregon, and Sarah, I'm pretty sure, turned me on to reading it. And I brought it with me. And I was practicing the lessons within it in each insight, practicing synchronicity and practicing talking to strangers and practicing following the signs and practicing keeping my energy high and letting go of my control dramas, you know. And so when I went over there and started having those conversations with these new friends, I mean, with Charlie and Debbie, but also with Colin was what I for a little time dated this guy Colin. Not really, I would say we probably more like just hooked up a few times, but he wasn't really my type, but he reminded me a lot of Bono from U2. So I was like all like, you know, and they're Scottish accents. I mean, I fell in love with every single person I met. Like there was another guy too that I fell in love. I brought to the pub a few times and everybody was like, no, not that one. You know?
That's so funny.
So yeah, so for like, let's see, December, Charlie and I didn't really start hooking up until like March or maybe April. I think I moved in with him in May, you know, so it was a long time, like 5 or 6 months of me like, you know, playing the field over there. And so Colin, I remember, and then this other musician that played at the pub a lot, hung out at the pub a lot. His name was Stevie Flynn. And Stevie, I introduced Stevie to Fish. And I remember I had okay, I'm dating myself. I had my CD player. I had my Walkman CD player, you know, I had my CDs with me. So I was playing the CD of Fish and I was like, you've got to listen to this song Antelope, because as a musician, it's going to blow your mind. And I'm watching him, I'm drinking my little half pint of Guinness and I'm watching him, you know, listen to this, right? And I'm watching his face and he's like it's like melting his face off, this song. And I mean, and we're talking about someone that's like grown up on Led Zeppelin and all of the, like, you know, he's probably 10 years older than me, so he, you know, has maybe been to some of those shows, even like legends, Eric Clapton. You know, you live in the UK, you have access to musicians that we don't have access to. So
Mhm.
and you know, he's not like 20 or 30 years older than me, so I don't think he was at like a Jimi Hendrix show, but you know, I mean, we're talking about musicians that played for a long period of time and still do, right? So to watch his face melt off with this song is like totally revolutionary music. Fish is like Grateful Dead kind of revolution. So anyway, so back to the Celestine Prophecy, like I'm reading to them like it's like a new book of spiritual awakening, you know. I mean, this was a whole
Mhm.
like second wave of the 60s, right, of us like, you know, really coming into to awareness as indigos. So if you're familiar with the generations of spiritual beings that have been born here, my generation is the first generation of indigos. Mary, your generation is the crystal children. So you all have big eyes. You say things like, I know, you know, you're connected to your intuition like that. Like you're very intuitive, you know, very wise. You come in a lot of these children come in with no karma. Our generation is carrying a lot of that, a lot of the groundwork
Mhm.
for intuition, a lot of the groundwork for um, uh, connecting to source and letting go of karma, you know, ancestral karma and dramas and um, yeah, spiritual awakening, connecting to crystals, right? Um, and the indigos have been coming in since the 60s. Like that was kind of the first wave of indigos, but my generation is definitely pretty much all indigo children versus, you know, like sprinkles of indigos in the 60s and 70s,
Mhm.
right? So, so anyway, having all of these people there, like learning with me, I felt like this pub was like an incubator for awareness, spirituality, and open.
So
Just
you
all
would
open.
read the insights to them,
Yeah.
like
Yep.
insight number one, day one, and then second day you'd read insight number two during
Yeah, I
breaks.
mean, I
Or
had the book with me, so I was reading, I was reading it over and over again. Another cool story, I'm looking at the clock going, we're not moving through this very quickly, but it doesn't matter. I almost feel like this might need to be split into 2 episodes.
I feel like it
Okay, so maybe we'll
is
do
a
that.
lot.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And so yeah, and yeah, in any event. So there's one story I want to tell really quickly. I was at the library, one of the places I hung out at that was a free place to hang out, that was warm and dry, and it wasn't the pub. Pubs aren't open at all hours of the day. Ours was open at 11, but from 8 to maybe 11 because they'd served lunch as well. But I would hang out at this library, plus one of the first guy that they were all like, not this guy, his name was Gregor,
Yeah.
not this guy, right?
Mhm.
He worked at worked at the coffee shop in the bookstore. So big Barnes and Noble type bookstore. And I'm walking through the metaphysical aisle, and it was like really tall stacks of books. I'm walking through, and a book falls off the shelf at me. And it's higher than anybody on the other side of the bookshelves could have pushed. So it falls at my feet, and I look at it and I'm like, maybe I'm supposed to read this book, right? Because at this point, I trust synchronicity. And I'm also very connected to my spirit guides. So I hear the voice, Merlin's voice, go, "That's your book." And I'm like, oh, okay. So Merlin kicked it off the shelf for me. And I pick it up and I'm looking at it, and it says "The Only Planet of Choice." This is the title of the book. Big globe on the cover, black book, big glowing blue planet on the cover, right? The Only
Mhm.
Planet of Choice, Phyllis Schwimmer. So I open it up, and it's a channeling of this being, intergalactic being called Tom. And in the room of all of her channels, she would go into, this space and channel. And if anyone's heard of Abraham Hicks, it's like that, right? Esther
Mhm.
Hicks. Okay. It's
Yes.
Esther. This is Esther Hicks in a different body. And she's channeling Tom. And that's what Sarah did as well. Sarah Felez, my teacher in Oregon, same, very similar to Esther Hicks, right? Being comes in. So anyway, so in the room, every time that Phyllis would channel, was Gene Roddenberry of Star Trek, and George Lucas of Star Wars, and several politicians in and out. Like, I mean, not every time. The room would kind of rotate of who was in the room with her. But this whole book is like, the premise is written in the early 80s or late 70s. Is a premise of a lot of Star Trek stories, right? So this is the other book that I'm reading to these guys, and all of us together are like, our minds are getting like expanded, of like, is this like, how, that's bullshit. There's no way. Like, how is someone like, aliens? Like, no, like,
These
and then
must have been really new concepts back
really
then.
new concepts. Yeah. That book is out of print, but you can still get it. I still have a copy of it, and I've shared copies with it. And most people who read it are like, I can't even stomach this. Not stomach, but like digest this. I can't even digest this. Doesn't even make sense to me. I don't understand this. So it's very heady, very cool book.
I think that's like, sometimes I wish that information wasn't so available as it is now, because it's not the same when you learn something new. Because I just Googled it. So it's not as revolutionary as reading it off of a book or discovering it yourself. Maybe 20 years ago, information would have been more, it was more of a rarity, like new concepts, and you read it and it really sticks. I think that's the thing now, that even though there's so much information going around, not a lot of it sticks because of the way that people discover it. It's just so easy, and there's a lot of it, and there's so much to take in. So sometimes I just wish that it was a little bit more difficult, But
Yeah.
maybe that's just really my privileged self saying, oh my gosh, you know, learning's so easy now. But I mean, thank you, technology, but at the same time, it's get so distracted easily, and
Yeah.
learning is more difficult.
So there was no internet, no cell phones,
Yeah.
no, I mean, I had a CD player, right? So, no MP3s, right? So, we had something called Prodigy that you could get on. It was like we had a server. We did have like the dinosaur of the internet. So I could
I did
email.
hear of that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I could
It's a
email
search engine.
people. And you could, yeah, I mean, it was the Gen 1, right, of the World Wide Web. But you weren't really using it, you were still getting your information from books. But you were as you were speaking, I was thinking of like Plato, right? Or uh um Socrates, right? And or Einstein. Okay. So like any of these thought leaders at the time, they're immersing in thoughts and creating and channeling. I mean, most of those guys channeled, right? Like they would tell you, right? Like this isn't coming from me, this is coming from source. Um, and they would get into a meditative or trance-like state to or even use psychedelics, right? Or herbs or
Yeah.
whatever, right? To get into that state. So there have been waves and waves for centuries of awareness and awakening and shifting of thought, right? Like if you think of Darwin, and
Yeah.
shifting,
Just
right?
different thought leaders and different methods of acquiring
But
information.
you're immersed in that for a long period of time. You're not like, oh, squirrel, right? Like now there's so many different avenues that information can come from. Like for instance, I'm taking, because of the farm that we're creating, I'm taking a course in composting toilets. It's all I can do to focus on this course because I have so many other things that I'm doing that I can't really quite immerse myself in understanding composting toilets the way I want to, right? And I'm missing, I
Cool.
miss a class and then I have to catch up, and right. It's like it's very hard to just drown out the noise and commit to reading the Celestine Prophecy now compared to how it was when I was reading it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Again, I think it's just so much easier to get information exhaustion nowadays,
Yeah.
because like even the information that's so out of this world and you read it from your phone or your computer, it's like blah, because it lacks the impact of getting it from somewhere else that could have been more revolutionary, you know? So it's a
Yeah.
very interesting topic that we segued to that I would like to talk about more, but I know that we have like 5 more bullet points supposedly that we're, talk about in this episode. So I'm not sure, should we cut this in half or
Yeah.
let's just keep going?
No, let's create okay, so we'll splice it there.
Okay.
And that, I mean, that's even long. That's longer, I think, than a half an hour that we've been, maybe 40 minutes now. So let's splice it there. So we'll stop the recording and then start it again. You and I will stay on. But if you've been watching this, tune into the next episode because this is definitely going to be 2 episodes. We still have a lot of talking points to cover. Thank you for following us. Thank you for subscribing to both of our channels. And we really appreciate you. If you're interested in the Celestine Prophecy, please take a look at the Manifesting with Synchronicity course that I teach. Mary is about to launch a couple of free journeys for us, so we'll have a little mini version of Manifesting with Synchronicity very soon that you can check out. And for those of you that are listening to this on Mary's channel, Not So Good at Small Talk, yeah, keep following us along on there as well. So thank you, everybody. And I'm going to go ahead and stop.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Mary.